Welcome. Welcome to the final day of the 34th International Churchill Conference. As a number of you know, I'm an opera fan, so I'm going to compare our conference so far to the opera. We had a magnificent opening Act 1 on Tuesday night with the screening of Darkest Hour and the interview with the director, Joe Wright. Yesterday, Act 2, we had a beautiful aria by Lady Williams. And then a climactic moment before the curtain went down last night on Act 2. And after the interval, we've got Act 3 today. And I promise you it's going to be a fitting conclusion. So to introduce our first panel of the morning, I'd like to introduce to you, straight from Chartwell, the magnificent Zoe Colbeck.
Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here in a room with fellow Churchillians, sharing stories and finding out what inspired you about Winston. It's been a really lovely day and a half. At Chartwell, we're more of an expert on the family life of Sir Winston Churchill, and it was very exciting yesterday to hear Celia and Lady Williams talking about what it was like to be a secretary at Chartwell. And part of the project we're doing at Chartwell, Churchill's Chartwell, we plan to open the secretary's room in 2020. So if you want to hear more about that, there's some in your packs about the project. In terms of Churchill and Ireland, I was trying to think what we had in the collection about that, and we've got a gift from Londonderry of a replica of Roaring Meg, which is one of my favourite items in the house. It's in the library. And I was really interested yesterday to start to hear a little bit about Churchill's relationship with Attlee from Lord Owen, and we're going to hear a lot more about that now. So we've got another family of writers like the Churchills here. We've got the Bews with us this morning, so very excited to hear what they're going to say. And we have Lord Bew, who is Professor of Politics at Queen's University in Belfast. And we have John Bew, who is Professor of... No, I've got that the wrong way, right? So you, politics... I'm sorry, Lord Bew. So Lord Bew... There's no lectern to put my notes. Yeah. And so Lord Bew is our politics expert, and John Bew is our history professor and foreign affairs and award-winning historian. And they're going to give us an excellent talk this morning, starting off with John. So can we have a big warm welcome for the Bews?
Thank you, Zoe. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, in the background. I'd just like to thank, again, the organisers for an absolutely fantastic conference so far. It's been wonderful at many, many levels, and a particular thanks to myself, to Michael Bishop, who extended the invitation out to me, and it's doubly a pleasure because I think it was in 2012 we first met when I gave a lecture at the Library of Congress, which about 6 people turned up at, and Michael was one of them. We've stayed in touch since then, so he was with me at my darkest hour, if you like. So it's very nice to be here today. My father and I were discussing as to how to break up our talk, and hopefully it'll be something of a conversation, but while we're related, our books are not related. So then we had a discussion as to who to go first, and on the basis of youth and book sales, we went for me. But he will no doubt interrupt at various points over the course of my talk. So I want to talk about the relationship that Clement Attlee had with Winston Churchill, and more specifically, because we're in a Churchill conference, I want to talk about the insights I think that Attlee offers about Churchill's character and particularly strategy during the Second World War. And I could start talking about Churchill and Attlee through many anecdotes, some apocryphal, some true, that Churchill said, for example, that Attlee was a modest man with much to be modest about, or a sheep in wolf's clothing, or the famous one that's perhaps too crude to mention before the watershed, but I must do anyway, which is the story of them entering a urinal in the war cabinet during the Second World War, where apparently Winston shuffled off to one corner, and Attlee said, "Unusually modest for you, Winston," to which Churchill replied, "Anytime you socialists see something big, you want to nationalize it." I'm not sure how much any of this is true, but just to say that while there was lots of disparaging remarks attributed to Churchill about Attlee, the interesting thing is that Churchill would never allow anyone else to disparage Attlee in his company, and he would reply and say, no, Mr. Attlee is a great patriot. Do not ever criticize him in my company. And there's a really close relationship that extends to the latter portion of their life, and one of my favorite stories, really, as Winston got deafer and deafer in later years, Attlee would sit by his side and just be talked to by him, and Churchill couldn't hear anything back. But that really says actually perhaps something about their relationship. And it's a relationship that actually has a number of interesting sort of punctuation points, and it goes back to the fact that the first connection between Churchill and Attlee is actually they shared a governess for a while called Miss Hutchison, who was the Attlee family sort of homeschooler as well in Putney, who didn't last very long with Churchill, it must be said. And the Attlees used to tell this story of how the bell would come ringing from Churchill's room when he was in with his governess, Miss Hutchison, and the maid would come running in and say, "What's wrong?" And young Winston would reply, "Mrs. Hutchison is very cross. Please remove her from the room." So that's the first sort of connection. There was a kind of a familiarity there. The second connection is that Attlee was a conservative, an imperialist in his school days. And the one thing for which he ever got in trouble in school was overzealously celebrating the relief of Ladysmith in the Boer War, which, of course, he was reading Winston Churchill's reports from that. So that's when he first became aware of Churchill. There was 9 years between them. Secondly, when Churchill was elected in Oldham in 1900, Attlee remembered reading about this young rising star of our party. As I say, Attlee was a conservative, growing up. By 1911, interestingly, and this is perhaps my favorite connection between the two, at Sydney Street in 1911, when Churchill was Home Secretary and sends in the army to deal with a sort of incident with a series of Latvian anarchists, incredibly, in Sydney Street, Attlee is there watching it going on as a social worker and a socialist in the local community. His own career is transformed, but this odd scene of Churchill with his top hat and cane ordering the army in, and Attlee on the other side with the working classes of the area as a social worker, dedicated socialist by that stage, really is a very striking one. And then also Lord Owen talked about this. 5 years later, Attlee finds himself at Gallipoli fighting in Churchill's campaign, and he is the second last man off the beach at Suvla Bay. And on that note, I will let my father come in here, because Gallipoli is important, and I'm going to come back to it, but he has a point to make about Gallipoli.
Well, we've talked quite a bit about Gallipoli at this conference, and I agree with everything that I've heard, but I want to add one point. Gallipoli is very important for Ireland. It's not just Australians who die there and New Zealanders. It's a good section of the soldiers who die are Irish, and more importantly, it's the type of soldiers. It's the flower of Irish society. It's the moderate unionists, it's the moderate nationalists who have joined up and who die at Gallipoli. It's a particular grouping. It's really the flower of Irish society, and they're often from professional backgrounds and so on. They die in their droves. Now, why I think I want to make this point is that Churchill always, and he knew some of these people, Major Grimshaw, who dies, had been imprisoned alongside Churchill in the same cell in South Africa. He knew him. He would have known the sons of Irish MPs who die, Irish nationalist MPs at Westminster. And if you look at the plaque in Westminster Hall, you'll see there are as many sons of Irish nationalist MPs dying as that of other mainstream British parties. He knew these people, and yet he says very little about it. Whereas he always, writing about South Africa, writes a lot about Irish military prowess, how great soldiers the Irish are. Now, the significance of this is there's an unease in Churchill about this, because in 1921, when you get the troubles in Ireland and the awful violence and the sectarianism and the bitterness and the savagery of the IRA campaign, organised baboonery, Churchill called it, he constantly says, where are the decent Irishmen that I knew? Where are the sane moderates on both sides? The answer, I'm afraid, is a lot of them are dead at Gallipoli. And it's something he never really faces up to.
pick up from that, Attlee in Gallipoli is hugely proud to have fought at Gallipoli. In fact, Attlee is carried off the battlefield 3 times in the First World War, and his war record becomes a major part of his political identity thereafter. It distinguishes him from the conchies, or the conscientious objectors, in the labour movement. It's a huge part of the relationship with Churchill thereafter. So even when they're having strifes and arguments in the 1920s, when they're both MPs, Attlee is always prepared to say, I'm prepared to give the devil his due. Churchill was right about Gallipoli, to the extent that he says it's the one great strategic idea in the last war. Now, the reason why that matters is it sets the tone for the relationship between them. And you can imagine them meeting in the lobby, and they do meet in the lobby over the course of the 20s and the 30s, and they have this respect between them, the major and the man who sent the major out to this part of the world. And one thing that's very striking in Attlee's correspondence is actually it really blows up the idea of the wilderness years, which of course is part of the Churchill self-narrative, is that in his letters to his family, Winston, as he refers to him, looms so large throughout the 30s in all these debates. He's kind of a point of reference, even when he seemed to be out in the cold politically, he's constantly referred to. No, Attlee thinks Winston is completely off the mark on things like India, but their stars start to align over the course of the 30s because they share basically ultimately a similar worldview that many on the left sneer at as sort of simplistic, but Attlee believes in the same core Western values as Churchill does when it comes to the crunch. And he's not an apologist for the Soviet Union, he's not an apologist for totalitarianism, he doesn't bat his eyes at Mussolini as many on the left and many on the right do as well. That core sort of sense of Western energetic bipartisanship really starts over the course of the 30s, and we heard that stressed very importantly. So it means by the time you come to May 1940, there's this famous cartoon, which some of you may be aware of, by David Lowe, the sort of preeminent cartoonist of the time, called All Behind You, Winston. And it has the coalition government lining up behind Churchill as he rolls up his sleeves and marches into battle. And that was Attlee's proudest moment, to the extent actually in Yale University Library, I went to see Lowe's papers. Attlee writes a letter to Lowe and he asks for the original copy. And later when Lowe puts it up for an exhibition, Attlee and Attlee's wife insist they will have that copy back, by the way. It really is his proudest moment to step into the wartime coalition with Churchill in 1940. And it's not just that relationship means a sort of broader and large respect for Churchill's strategic mind. It also shapes how Attlee guides the Labour into the wartime coalition. Because he says a few things about Gallipoli. He says that the reason why he thinks it was badly organised in the First World War was due to poor generalship, but also political squabbling at home. And the first thing he says to Churchill when they're discussing the balance of the coalition is that I will not squabble over seats. I was an old Gallipoli man. You give me whatever seats you want, Winston, and we will proceed from that basis. So he has a strong view that sort of internal struggling and causing issues or jostling for advantage in the wartime coalition is not the way to proceed. And by the way, he's under immense pressure from his party to do precisely that throughout the war. And he's always sticking and backing with Churchill. His colleague Herbert Morrison basically comes to the conclusion that Attlee had decided right at the start of the war to back Winston on all the key strategic decisions. And much as we've talked about this great success story, really 40, 41, up to Christmas of 42, the war does not go well for Britain and it does not go well for Churchill. And there are plenty of sharks circling around him, including some of those like Lord Beaverbrook or Latterly Eden, who are supposed to be closest to him. So it's not just during the last flushes of appeasement that Greenwood and Attlee backed Churchill, it's through all those early major strategic decisions. And that relationship is absolutely crucial, and I think Attlee needs to be given his due. And actually Churchill did appreciate him on all those key strategic decisions. Because who's criticising Attlee for being too sycophantic to Churchill? Beaverbrook is criticising Attlee, but also the generals. And Attlee backs Churchill against the generals on a series of key strategic decisions. Now, you can say he does so because he's a simplistic thinker or he's too sycophantic to Winston. That's what his party said. That's what the general said. But I've got to finish by suggesting that actually Attlee had a broader appreciation of what he called higher strategy, which distinguished Churchill from the generals, in particular the chiefs of the general staff, who he thought had a more limited conception of strategy. And also Attlee understood that Churchill had a better appreciation and understanding of what he calls the precarious balance of coalition warfare. in particular the key generals and Allenbrook, and he also says this about Montgomery as well. He feels, Attlee, that they do not appreciate the difficulties of getting the Americans into the war, but also the necessity of steering them towards key strategic theaters that Britain values most importantly. And this goes to a point that I've heard Andrew Roberts make on a number of occasions, which is that act of American statesmanship, the decision to fight first in Europe, is the most selfless act of statesmanship in the 20th century. But it is not an inevitability. And Attlee, following Churchill, believes that Churchill has managed to achieve this, I say, finely balanced coalition through this effective relationship with the Americans across the peace. And actually, it's his generals who sometimes, by squabbling or complaining about Eisenhower's command, actually potentially jeopardize at various points in time. So that's the first sort of level of appreciation. Secondly, Attlee understands that with the key strategic maneuvers in the war, the politics of what Churchill is doing. So therefore, he supports things that the generals regard as actually quite absurd, like the suggested campaign in Sumatra, for example. These sort of attention-grabbing, agenda-setting political maneuvers that Churchill wants to try at various points. And I think back to that quote from Ismay yesterday that under Churchill, Britain had essentially one army engaged in three theaters simultaneously. Attlee appreciates and understands what Churchill's trying to do there, which is to set the political agenda. And the big example, although they fail over Sumatra, the big example is Britain leading the invasion of Italy. And that's what, Churchill turns to Attlee at various points and says, they respect us now. So the political optics of these strategic maneuvers, I think Attlee has a pretty refined appreciation, I say, this broader, higher strategy. I'm going to hand over to my father in a moment, but just to say, Attlee is responsible, I think, for one of the most incisive and interesting quotes about Churchill when reflecting on him in later years. He said, I used to compare him to one of those layer cakes. He had a 17th century layer, an 18th century layer, a 19th century layer, and sometimes even a 20th century layer. And the thing about Winston was you were never sure which layer was uppermost.
Thank you, John. That last comment of Attlee's reminds me of a different variant of the layer cake, less flattering to Churchill. John Delancey, who was the Irish ambassador from neutral Ireland in London, and unhappy with Churchill's stand towards Ireland during the war, had a meeting with Bevan, and he said to him, John Delancey, by the way, had known Churchill a long time, had backed him in Manchester politics in the first decade of the 20th century. So it was a long-standing relationship. But Delancey says he's stuck in the 18th century now. This is particularly due to the tone of some of the things which I'll come back to that Churchill was saying about Irish neutrality. And Bevan said, you just don't understand. Even on India, he really gets it. His commitment is to the Parliament of Man. He knows what's going to have to come after this war. You're just falling for this image of a actually, Delancey says, I think he's stuck in the 18th century. You're falling for something which is not really their style. In substance, Churchill knows exactly what's going to happen, including with India. And it's a very interesting conversation. And he's not hostile to Ireland in the way that you think he is. And to add to that document I came across after finishing the book, the Foreign Office archivist gave me, was a telegram from Churchill on 19th September 43, saying if Ireland comes in now, we will support Irish unity because he thinks that the Unionists in the North will go along with that because Ireland has demonstrated its British support for the British war effort. Everything will change, and I'm quite happy to support Irish unity. There are a lot of other people in the cabinet saying, don't play with this. And indeed, as the war went on, and it became clear who was going to win, as nations all over the world started to declare war on Hitler, British cabinet's attitude is pretty cool. They can see these people leaping in the spoils. And they discuss, what do we do here if Ireland late on, having been neutral, having in many respects objectively aided the German war effort in the 5,000 British sailors with the Admiralty assessment had lost their lives because of the lack of Irish naval facilities which had been withdrawn from Britain. What do we do if they suddenly dive in? And most of the cabinet are actually holding Churchill back then. And by the end of the war, Churchill is in the same position. They don't come in. And he makes the speech, which is so critical and so disliked in Ireland, of Irish neutrality, where he talks about Mr. De Valera frolicking with Hitler. And he's saying the light of freedom was only preserved by the fact that Northern Ireland, the Unionist part of the North, had remained part of the war, and American soldiers could be stationed there. There were military facilities and so on, which were vital to the war in the Atlantic, etc. So there is a problem here for this talk, because John, when he talks about Attlee, is talking about somebody who really did engage sympathetically with Churchill. When I talk about Ireland and Churchill, Churchill, for all his life, engaged sympathetically with Ireland and was fascinated by it. But Ireland has actually a colder and more ambiguous relationship with Churchill. And that's the unevenness between these two talks, but I'll try and deal with that. But to return to the beginning, Churchill's whole life has these significant Irish phases in it. His first public appearance is in Dublin, where his father is working in Dublin as an aide to the Lord Lieutenant, Churchill's grandfather. When a portrait of Churchill is presented to the Dublin press, there's a certain amount of tittering. I read the newspaper reports about this child in the Dublin press in 1878. Not everybody thought it was the most beautiful portrait or child they'd ever seen. But from that moment on, he's put Dublin stories. He's told by his nanny the Fenians are terribly worrying people. More importantly, he says he remembers the present he received from Thomas Burke, who was the top civil servant in Ireland, a Catholic, who was assassinated in Phoenix Park. He said, I can't remember what he looked like, but I can remember the gift he gave me, the drum. And that's because that links Churchill to the most important political assassination of the 19th century, after Spencer Perceval, maybe, in 1882, in the Phoenix Park. So there's always this emotional connection. He has cousins in Ireland, two of whom are on the Leslies and also Morton Fruin, roughly on the nationalist side, and one of whom, the Londonderrys, is very much on the Unionist side. Standing for Parliament in all the time, these families engaged at a high level in politics in all the time that Churchill is involved in politics. After he joins the Liberals, Churchill gradually becomes accepting of the broad Liberal view that Home Rule is right for Ireland. It's a slow process. When he first joins the Liberals and makes the switch, he says, I'm making the switch, but I don't really believe the Liberals are right about Ireland. But then, over the next few years, up to 1910, Irish nationalists pick up on it. He becomes more and more identified with sympathy for the Home Rule cause. He mimics in some way, broadly speaking, his career, that of his father. This is a very crude, sketchy way to look at it. His father started out as a very strong unionist and then had a flirtation with Irish nationalism in the mid-1880s, or an engagement, to be more accurate, with Parnell, and then reverted to being a strong unionist. And in some ways, Churchill's career has the same structure. He starts out as a very strong unionist, then has an engagement with moderate Irish nationalism, with John Redmond and then Michael Collins, and then in his later career is identified more with unionism. All the time there are shades in this. All the time, after a very strong unionist statement, there'll be a friendly message sent to the Irish embassy in London. So all the time this is complicated messaging, but that's the broad picture. And he follows his father's pattern. Unionist first, then engagement with moderate nationalism because he thinks it's in British interest. And of course, America's important here. It's not the only reason why he's so interested and why he's at times prepared to make concessions to Irish nationalism, but he does think of the Irish as in principle part of the English-speaking peoples, and that therefore, and he does know, people have talked about Bert Cochrane, for example, at this conference, the importance of the Irish in American politics. Very, very important in holding Roosevelt back from engagement in the war, which he's fully aware of, encouraged by the Irish government, because that was their selling point with the Nazis, that we can hold back America because of our control of this population. And he's aware of all this. He gives up in the end. 1937, he writes a piece in which he says, I've always wanted the Irish to be a part of the story of the English-speaking peoples. Actually, it's not happening. There's a book review, which is a passage. I know it's not happening. And in 1938, he writes an essay about Parnell, which is absolutely brilliant essay. I think he did consult with his cousin Shane Leslie, who had a lot of knowledge of Irish nationalism. But it's a brilliant essay, which really is superior to most of the subsequent academic historiography of Parnell over the next 50 years. But one of the things about that essay It's a book, Great Contemporaries, because as a boy he'd seen Parnell, he'd been taken in by his father, and he'd seen Parnell in the House of Commons. So the Great Contemporaries are all people we'd known at some level or seen. And in this case, he had seen Charles Stewart Parnell, who died in 1891, the great Irish nationalist leader. But one of the things about that essay is this: it's not just a lament for Parnell's greatness. Its brilliance is it sees the conservative side of Parnell, which is what had attracted Churchill's father to him, and why there was a close relationship for a year or so. It sees this clearly in a way that many historians miss for decades. It's a brilliant, brilliant essay, but it's also a lament for Churchill, because he's writing, as people have said, this conference at the end of the 1930s, and he's saying, Ireland's really, really important when I dealt with it. For 40 years, it convulsed the Imperial Parliament from 1880 to 1920, convulsed it, and endless difficult issues arose during the Home Rule crisis. There was almost a civil war. I was in on that. I worked on that. Actually, probably made quite a lot of mistakes in his handling of that. We'd switch around from one position to another in a slightly incoherent way. But then I dealt with the IRA war, brought that to a reasonable compromise conclusion, and as has been said already, this conference was widely respected for doing that. But actually, he says, everybody's forgotten what I did, because everybody's forgotten about Ireland. He describes it in 1938 as a small place, as a collection of agricultural counties gathered together for no significant purpose, no wider purpose. And that's not just a kind of jibe at what Ireland had become. It's also, here am I, Winston Churchill. This was big stuff. I was heavily involved in it, and certainly in 1921-22 played a major role in switching off this war, which looked as if it was getting completely and utterly out of control.